Donald Trump went to South Carolina asking voters to protect him from impeachment, and the speech itself showed why his political vulnerability is becoming part of his campaign message. He was heckled. He openly warned that Republicans could lose everything in the midterms, and he repeatedly returned to the possibility that he could be impeached. That matters, because Trump was not speaking like a politician, simply celebrating strength. He was asking supporters to connect their vote directly to his personal political survival. And when you examine what he actually said about the economy, Iran, guns, prices, and his own future, the contradiction becomes difficult to ignore. Trump was selling confidence while repeatedly describing threats to his power. Start with the scene itself. Trump was speaking in South Carolina when someone in the audience heckled him. His response was dismissive. That person's going home to mom. That moment alone would normally be little more than rally theater. Presidents get heckled, candidates get heckled, crowds are messy. But what followed is more revealing, because Trump quickly moved from dealing with a protester to talking about impeachment. He told the audience, "I'm going to be impeached. They're going to impeach me." Then, while urging supporters to vote in the midterms, he described the stakes in remarkably personal terms. "You're going to lose everything. I'm going to have to go through impeachment." Notice the construction. There are two different consequences in that sentence. The audience is told that they could lose everything. Trump says he could face impeachment. Those consequences are then politically fused together. That is worth examining carefully. Because impeachment is not something voters automatically trigger by electing members of the opposing party. It is a constitutional process involving the House and, for removal, the Senate. What Trump was doing here was political framing. He was telling supporters that a bad midterm result would not merely affect legislation or control of Congress. It could expose his presidency personally. And that gives us our first real answer. The impeachment language was not an accidental aside. Trump repeated it. He connected it directly to turnout. His own words show that fear of what could happen after the midterms is already part of the argument he is making to voters. Now, ask yourself, what standard should apply here? If a president from the opposite party repeatedly told voters that congressional elections had to protect him personally from impeachment, would you treat that as an ordinary policy argument or as something fundamentally different? Because the speech becomes even stranger when you compare that anxiety with the image of overwhelming success Trump tried to project minutes later. Trump told the audience that the United States has the greatest economy in our history. He said the job numbers were excellent. He complained that polling on his handling of the economy did not reflect what he believed the economic numbers deserved. At one point, after referring to a 44% figure, he suggested he should perhaps be at 100% on the economy. That is a fascinating political contradiction. If voters already experience the economy as historically great, why does Trump need to explain why they apparently have not recognized it yet? His own language acknowledges the gap. He said some people haven't seen it yet, but they will. That sentence matters more than the superlatives around it because it quietly admits the central political problem. Declaring prosperity is not the same thing as persuading people that they are prosperous. A president can point to employment figures, growth, markets, investment, or any other favorable indicator. Those numbers deserve to be examined on their merits. But voters experience an economy through something more immediate. The grocery bill, housing, fuel, insurance, wages, debt, and whether their paycheck actually stretches farther at the end of the month. Trump himself seemed aware that affordability remained unfinished business. Later in the same speech, while discussing inflation, he moved between saying he had already solved it and saying it was mostly solved and would soon be solved. He then connected further improvement to fuel prices coming down. Those are not identical claims. "I solved inflation" describes a completed achievement. "Mostly solved" describes an incomplete achievement. "It'll be soon solved" describes something expected in the future. All three versions appeared inside essentially the same argument. That does not prove that every favorable economic claim Trump made was wrong. It establishes something narrower and more useful. The certainty of his political sales pitch was stronger than the certainty contained in his own explanation. And this is where political messaging can become deceptively effective. A viewer hears greatest economy, inflation solved, and strong job numbers. And those phrases create an immediate conclusion before the qualifications arrive. The qualification may technically be present, but emotionally, the verdict has already been delivered. That mechanism matters regardless of who uses it. If you would reject a Democratic president saying inflation was solved while simultaneously promising that it would soon be solved, consistency requires applying the same test to Trump. Then came another claim that deserves even closer scrutiny because this one moves beyond domestic politics. Trump told the South Carolina audience that he views the Strait of Hormuz as American territory right now. That is an extraordinary statement. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most strategically important waterways, and Trump was discussing it in the context of Iran and nuclear weapons. Whatever political or military point he intended to communicate, saying that he views the strait as American territory is fundamentally different from saying the United States intends to protect navigation, maintain military influence, defend shipping, or pursue a security policy there. Words matter more when presidents use them around military power. And Trump did not make the atmosphere calmer a few minutes later. While talking casually about having plenty of time on a Friday night, he joked about going back and bombing Iran a little bit more. That deserves a distinction the original outrage surrounding a clip can easily erase. A joke is not an operational order. It does not establish that another strike is planned. It does not tell us what military commanders have been instructed to do. But that does not make the remark meaningless. A president talking publicly about bombing another country is speaking from an office capable of ordering military action. The power behind the joke is real, even when the sentence is delivered for laughs. That is why the responsible question is not whether Trump was literally announcing an attack. The available material does not establish that. The question is why presidential war rhetoric is being treated as rally entertainment at the same moment he is making sweeping claims about American control of a strategic international waterway. And consider the consistency test again. If a Democratic president joked at a campaign event about bombing a country while claiming a strategically vital foreign waterway was effectively American territory, would Trump supporters dismiss the language as harmless comedy? That question should not depend on the party of the president. There is a broader information problem running through this speech. Trump moves rapidly between statements that sound factual, predictions about what will happen, political exaggerations, personal opinions, jokes, and claims about his own record. If those categories get blended together, the audience can live with far more certainty than the underlying statements justify. And that is exactly how politically engaged people can get trapped. You hear a powerful conclusion, repeat it because it matches what you already believe, and only later discover that the strongest version of the claim was not what the evidence actually established. The politician or creator gets the benefit of the message. You inherit the credibility problem when someone challenges you with the missing context. Don't Get Played the evidence discipline for American politics is a ready-to-use system for catching that gap before you react, including the simple discipline of separating a direct statement from the conclusion being built around it. It applies beyond this controversy to the next clip, poll, filing, statistic, or political narrative. The complete digital ebook is only $9, one time. Open the description and click the first link now. The same link is in the first pinned comment, because Trump's next argument creates an even sharper test of consistency. Trump told the crowd that the Second Amendment is under siege. He said he had protected it for 10 years and complained that every time there's an incident, it starts over and over again. The word incident is doing enormous work there. The source material interprets that as a reference to mass shootings and the renewed political demands for gun regulation that often follow them. Trump's actual quoted language, however, does not explicitly say in that passage that he supports school shootings, nor would the evidence provided justify such a conclusion. What it does show is Trump framing renewed pressure on gun policy after violent incidents, primarily as a threat to Second Amendment rights. That distinction matters. You can strongly oppose Trump's gun policy without inventing a position he did not state. In fact, the criticism becomes stronger when it is precise. His argument is that he has protected gun rights and intends to continue doing so, even as violent incidents repeatedly renew demands for regulation. That is the actual political conflict. What level of firearm regulation is compatible with the Second Amendment? What policies reduce violence without violating constitutional rights? What evidence supports those policies? Those are serious questions. Reducing the debate to one side loves guns and the other side hates freedom does not answer any of them. Trump then created an awkward moment while talking about Darlene Graham, beginning a phrase that sounded as though he was about to describe her as anti gun, before pivoting into saying she would protect the Second Amendment. Later, when he appeared uncertain whether a sound from the audience was supportive or hostile, he stopped and asked whether it was a good thing or a bad thing before deciding he liked what he thought he heard. Again, one awkward moment proves very little. But in the context of a speech already interrupted by heckling, those moments matter politically, because Trump's presentation depended heavily on the image of a unified audience and a confident movement marching toward victory. Then he raised the stakes dramatically. Trump called communism the single greatest threat to our country in history, explicitly comparing it with World War I, World War II, Pearl Harbor, and September 11th. He then tied defeating communism in America to defeating Democrats at the ballot box in November. That is not ordinary ideological criticism. A politician can argue that an opponent's economic policies are socialist, statist, misguided, excessive, or dangerous. Those claims can be tested against actual proposals, but describing the domestic political opposition through a threat framework that exceeds world wars, Pearl Harbor, and September 11th transforms electoral competition into something closer to an existential emergency. And once politics is framed that way, almost every compromise begins to look like surrender. Every election becomes survival. Every opponent becomes something more dangerous than an opponent. Every defeat becomes potentially illegitimate in the emotional logic of the message because voters have just been told that the threat is greater than some of the most catastrophic events in American history. That is why rhetoric cannot be separated completely from governance. Political language establishes the standards supporters use to interpret what happens next. Trump followed that attack by accusing Democrats of being communists, radical left lunatics, and people who hate the country. He returned to Hillary Clinton and her famous description of some Trump supporters as deplorable, criticizing the insult while using sweeping condemnations of his own political opponents. That contradiction is almost too clean. Trump argues that Clinton's language about his supporters was politically poisonous while using collective moral condemnation against Democrats. You do not need to defend Clinton's remark to see the inconsistency. In fact, you can believe her language was wrong and still ask Trump to meet the exact same standard. If politicians should not demean millions of voters because of their political affiliation, that rule cannot disappear when your preferred politician is doing the demeaning. And there is another reason this matters. Trump simultaneously told the audience that America is no longer a dumb country. He described an earlier United States as a dumb, stupid country, led by a very, very stupid person. He also insisted that under him, America had become great again and would no longer be laughed at. This is the emotional architecture of the speech. Humiliation followed by restoration. The country was stupid. Now it is smart. The country was laughed at. Now it is respected. The economy was damaged. Now it is supposedly the greatest ever. Inflation was terrible. Now it is solved, or mostly solved, or soon to be solved. Political enemies threaten everything. Trump can protect everything. And if Republicans lose the midterms, Trump says impeachment may follow. That structure is more important than any individual insult, because it explains why apparently unrelated subjects keep returning to the same destination. Personal political loyalty becomes the answer to national danger. The strongest defense of Trump here is straightforward. Campaign rallies are not policy seminars. Politicians exaggerate. They use humor. They simplify complicated economic conditions. They attack opponents. Trump has always spoken improvisationally, and supporters often interpret his most extreme lines as rhetorical rather than literal. Fair enough. That explanation probably accounts for part of what we are hearing, but it cannot account for everything. Improvisation does not erase repeated statements about impeachment. Humor does not make presidential references to bombing another country irrelevant. Rally rhetoric does not turn American territory into a precise description of the Strait of Hormuz. An exaggeration does not resolve the contradiction between inflation already being solved and inflation being something that will soon be solved. So, how much interpretive generosity should the public give a president? At what point does repeatedly explaining that a leader should not be taken literally become evidence that voters need a more disciplined way of deciding which presidential statements actually deserve belief. There is also a revealing moment involving beef prices. Trump said beef was coming down very rapidly. The source material surrounding the speech strongly disputes his broader affordability narrative, but it does not provide enough independent price data inside this record to establish the exact national beef price trend at that moment. So, the disciplined conclusion is not to replace Trump's unsupported certainty with our own. The correct move is to isolate the claim. What price category compared with what date? Retail or wholesale? Which cut? National average or selected market? How large is the decline? That may sound less emotionally satisfying than simply declaring Trump right or wrong, but this is exactly where political credibility is won or lost. A specific economic claim needs specific economic evidence. The same discipline applies to another striking part of the speech. When Trump attacked Democratic Senate candidate James Tallarico and said the candidate hates Christianity, while discussing comments involving Christianity and the Ten Commandments. The source material itself is aggressively dismissive of Trump's accusation, but it does not provide the full underlying remarks from Tallarico necessary to adjudicate exactly what he said in what context, or whether Trump's characterization fairly represents him. So we should not pretend we have evidence we do not have. What we can establish is that Trump used an accusation about hostility toward Christianity as part of his argument against the Democratic candidate. To determine whether that accusation is fair, you would need the candidate's complete statement, rather than Trump's description of it, or a commentator's description of Trump. That is a small example of a much larger rule. Never allow the person making an accusation to become your only source for what the accused person supposedly believes. Then came one of the most unusual policy claims of the night. While attacking policies concerning transgender minors, Trump said hospitals were now performing reverse surgery at his order. He added, "Nobody ever heard about it." That statement demands evidence, precisely because it is so specific. What order? Which hospitals? What does reverse surgery mean in the policy or medical context Trump was describing? How many procedures? Under what legal authority could a president order hospitals to perform them? The material provided here does not answer those questions. Therefore, the responsible conclusion is not that the procedures definitely occurred exactly as Trump described, and it is not that they definitely did not. It is that Trump made a concrete claim whose supporting mechanism is absent from the record we have. That evidentiary gap is politically important. A president is not just another person telling a story. When a president says hospitals are doing something at my order, the public has every reason to ask for the order. That is not partisan skepticism. It is the minimum standard we should apply to executive power. Reverse the parties. Imagine a Democratic president announcing at a rally that hospitals across America were performing a controversial procedure because the president personally ordered it without identifying the directive. Would conservatives reasonably demand to see the order? Of course they would. The same standard belongs here. And now, the speech begins to look different from the initial viral framing. The most important story is not that Trump was heckled. He was. It is not simply that the crowd appeared smaller than his critics expected. Crowd photographs can be argued over endlessly, depending on timing, angle, capacity, and which portion of a venue is visible. The material shows the commentator describing the crowd as tiny. But that description alone is not a reliable attendance count. The stronger evidence is Trump's own language. He repeatedly talked about impeachment. He warned supporters about losing everything in the midterms. He claimed the greatest economy in American history, while acknowledging some people had not seen it yet. He moved from inflation being solved to mostly solved to soon solved. He described the Strait of Hormuz as American territory. He joked about bombing Iran. He described communism as a threat greater than wars, Pearl Harbor, and September 11th, while connecting that threat directly to defeating Democrats. He attacked Hillary Clinton's language about voters while broadly condemning his own political opponents. And he claimed hospitals were conducting reverse surgery at his order without the supporting order appearing in the material before us. Those are not interpretations invented by a critic. Those are the substantive statements that deserve examination. And once you strip away the insults surrounding the clips, something important happens. the case against careless political rhetoric actually becomes stronger. Calling Trump names does not verify an economic statistic. Calling an audience delusional does not establish attendance. Calling a politician mentally ill does not prove a policy claim false. Calling someone pro-school shooting does not accurately substitute for analyzing his gun policy. Those attacks may produce emotional agreement among people who already dislike Trump, but they also give supporters an easy escape route. Instead of confronting the contradiction, they can attack the exaggeration. Evidence removes that escape route. Trump said what he said. The contradictions can be examined without embellishment. And the political stakes are clear, without pretending that every awkward sentence is proof of something larger. That brings us back to impeachment. At the beginning of this speech, Trump did not present the midterms simply as a referendum on Republican legislation. He personalized the potential consequence. If Republicans lose, he warned about impeachment. That tells us something about the political incentive behind the rest of the speech. Fear creates urgency. Economic triumph creates validation. External enemies create danger. Domestic ideological enemies create solidarity. Personal persecution creates loyalty. Put those ingredients together, and you have a campaign message in which Trump's political fate becomes inseparable from the fate of the country. But voters should separate them. A president's personal interest is not automatically the national interest. A party's electoral interest is not automatically the public interest. And an opponent winning an election is not automatically evidence that America has been destroyed. That separation is one of the basic requirements of democratic accountability. Presidents hold enormous power, but the office is temporary. Congress is supposed to exercise independent constitutional authority. Elections can change who controls it. Oversight can be aggressive, partisan, justified, unjustified, or some mixture depending on the specific case. None of that can be decided responsibly by starting with the assumption that protecting one politician from scrutiny is equivalent to protecting the country. So what does the evidence establish? It establishes that Trump was heckled during the South Carolina appearance and responded to it. It establishes that he repeatedly invoked impeachment and explicitly tied the danger of the midterms to his own potential impeachment. It establishes that he made sweeping economic claims while using more qualified language when discussing inflation. It establishes that he described the Strait of Hormuz as American territory, joked about bombing Iran, framed communism and Democrats in existential terms, defended his Second Amendment record, attacked political opponents, and made a specific claim about hospitals carrying out reverse surgery at his order. What does it not establish? It does not establish that every interpretation supplied by Trump's critics is correct. It does not give us enough evidence to diagnose Trump's mental condition. It does not prove that supporting gun rights means supporting mass shootings. It does not independently establish the precise size of the crowd, the exact current trend in every consumer price category, the complete context of Talarico's remarks, or the existence and scope of the hospital procedures Trump described. Those limits are not weaknesses in the investigation. They are the point. Because the strongest conclusion is the one that survives after you remove everything you cannot prove. And what survives here is politically significant. Trump is publicly campaigning against the possibility of losing congressional protection. At the same time, he is asking voters to accept extraordinarily confident claims about his performance and extraordinarily expensive claims about his opponents. His South Carolina speech repeatedly asked the audience to move between fear and triumph. America is doing better than ever, but everything could be lost. The economy is historically great, but people have not recognized it yet. Inflation is solved, but it will soon be solved. America is strong, but domestic political enemies represent an existential threat. The central contradiction is therefore not whether one heckler embarrassed Donald Trump. It is that a president presenting himself as overwhelmingly successful is simultaneously campaigning as though his political survival is under immediate threat. The midterms will eventually test whether voters accept that framing. Congress will determine what oversight or impeachment efforts actually materialize. Economic data can test economic claims. Documents can test claims about executive orders. Full remarks can test accusations against opponents. That is how this story should be judged. Not by who shouted loudest in South Carolina, by what can actually be demonstrated. And another political clip will arrive soon asking you to reach a conclusion before you have seen the full evidence. Someone will choose the framing, remove the inconvenient context, and invite you to lend your certainty to their political advantage. Become the person who isolates the claim before repeating it. Don't Get Played gives you a complete practical method for doing that across clips, polls, court filings, statistics, official statements, and synthetic media. The digital ebook costs only $9 as a one-time payment. Open the description and click the first link now. The same link is in the first pinned comment. Political reaction is easy. A conclusion you can defend requires evidence.